book 33 of 2020 was The End of Policing by Alex S. Vitale, I want to say. This book was really good. I gave this book 4 stars. It's all about kind of policing, obviously, with the name. It's an extensive critical analysis of policing and in America. He does make reference to other places like the UK, but it is predominantly about America. And he also suggests kind of alternatives to what's currently done and how to improve the current adopted practices for the benefit of the populace. So it's a really, really interesting dissection of policing and how it could be changed to make it more beneficial and to help more people. Obviously, what's necessary in a situation like this is some historical context, and that's what's kind of discussed first. So if you think about the police and where the police came from and why it was created, you know, this is why there's reference to the UK, because the Metropolitan Police is really famous for being the first, you know, police organisation to be kind of created within London. And essentially the police were created to protect the property of the elites. So they were there to stop property damage from the masses. So the police were never created to benefit the masses. Like, they're not there to protect you, they're there to protect the property of rich people. And so kind of, you know, that's gone through. He also talks about things like broken windows theory, and he's very critical of broken windows theory. So broken windows theory is like, sorry, there's like a fly flying around, really distracting. The broken windows theory is a theory by Wilson and Kelling, so 2 researchers, and what they suggest is that if there is, it's called broken windows theory because if there is some damage in the environment, like a broken window, it acts as a signal to people that that environment's not taken care of, and therefore almost invites more vandalism in that area. It's the same thing if there's like, you know, a bin that's been set on fire, or if there's like a if there's some like a swing that's broken on a play area or something like that, it gives that signal that it's okay to cause further damage. Well, this is kind of the argument, and this theory is not just a theory, it's actually been tested out by another researcher called Zimbardo, who's really, I didn't really say that properly, Zimbardo, so Philip Zimbardo, who's really, really famous for the Stanford Prison experiment. But he also did this where he went to Palo Alto, which is where he was kind of based. Like, a lot of his studies are over in that area. I think it's maybe where he was working at the university. And he left a car, abandoned the car, and it sustained no damage at all, even in really kind of like rough areas. No, I don't want to say the word rough, but like, you know, areas which are probably not well looked after. And nothing was really happening. And then he went out and he smashed the window of the car, like, you know, damaged it a little bit. And then after that, everyone was damaging it, people were stripping things out of it. And even people who were well-to-do, you know, dressed in shirts and suits, were coming to take things from the car. So the theory is that it doesn't matter what you're like as an individual. You know, you could be a very moral, good person, not to say that just because you've got a shirt and suit that you would be like that, but, you know, the idea is that it's only the people that are socioeconomically deprived that would be causing vandalism and crime, which is not the case. So this is kind of a social explanation for behaviour rather than an individual, you know, explanation for behaviour, or, you know, developmental or whatever other kind of theories that there are. So it's a really kind of influential theory within things like policing, because if you clean up an area before it gets out of hand, you will prevent the area from going into gentrification. Now, Vitale criticises this heavily and suggests that it doesn't work, but he is not actually talking about broken windows theory. He's talking about zero tolerance policing, which is something completely different. I mean, they are linked together, but the idea is that with zero tolerance policing is that you get 3 strikes and then you're in prison. Or the other kind of way of doing it is that you get put in prison for minor infractions. So, for example, like littering, or for, you know, I don't know, verbal abuse to a police officer or something. You know, minor things that you wouldn't necessarily get put in prison for or get official like reprimand for. Are taken like as if they're as serious as everything else. So it's where there's no kind of you know, difference in how serious it is. It's all deemed criminal behaviour, antisocial behaviour, and therefore you get kind of punishment for it. And Vitale's saying that this is not good because, and I can understand his points of view. I mean, when I taught this study to my students, I was teaching it from the social point of view, and I was teaching it probably one-sided, but obviously we criticise it and things like this. So, you know, there is both sides to it, but it's been found in New York to be really effective at reducing the crime rate. So there's that side of it that he didn't mention in this book. So knowing that myself, I kind of started to think, okay, maybe this he's obviously an expert in his area, but he's not being balanced in his argument. He's being kind of very one-sided. But I understand his point of view, because what he was saying was that you're putting people into the criminal justice system, and that's causing, you know, more problems later down the line, because, you know, there's other studies that show that if you get put in prison for a minor crime, you know, which zero tolerance policing does do, you then learn other crimes from the people that you're spending time in prison with, and you're more likely to carry on in the criminal justice system because of the way that makes you feel and all the things that, you know, have an impact of that. So you are actually making it worse further down the line. So zero tolerance policing might show that it's effective in the short term, but there's not long-term studies to suggest it is. And obviously this guy might know more about that, and that's where his point of view has come from. So it's just to be mindful, I think, when you're reading things like this, to not just accept what's being said and to actually read around it and look at kind of other critical sources. The other thing that he criticises is informal policing, and again, this is another thing that, you know, this is my perspective of it was different because of the way that I taught this. But informal community policing is what we had of old, which was where police could enforce people to behave in certain ways that weren't technically legal. So, for example, they could move people on from areas if they were being antisocial and vagrancy and stuff like that. Now, there is no legal basis for that, and if you know your rights, you can stick up for yourself and say, no, I'm not moving, because you don't have to legally move from areas just because a police officer tells you to. You're not under, you know, arrest and things like that. So if you know your rights, informal policing wouldn't work anyway. But because people don't know the rights, informal policing used to work. And I think the idea behind informal policing is that you get to know the people in your area, and like if you're a police officer in an area, and so you can maintain order in an informal way, and everyone's kind of got that rapport with police and you're working together as a community. And actually, when they've trialled this in areas, it has been found to be effective. But the downside of it, which is what Vitale focuses on, is that it leads to biases. You know, you've got lots of unconscious biases, and it leads to, you know, stop and search figures being affected by race and stuff like that. So it's not perfect, but it has been found to be effective. But Vitale's suggesting it's not because of the biases. So I think you've got to kind of look at it from both perspectives before you kind of make your mind up. But in this book, it's presented as being not very good. And I can understand it because, like I mentioned before, there's no legal basis for what they're asking you to do. And so therefore it is a violation of your rights. But remember, the police was never created for your rights in the first place. So really, like, you know, Vitale then also talks about how school expulsions have been found to lead to incarceration in a prison system. Like, there's a direct correlation between the two of them. If you've been excluded from school, you're more likely to go to prison. So he is advocating for school expulsions to be a last resort. I think when you have children who are very, you know, I was going to say very misbehaved, but I was going to say not well behaved, but I can't think of what I was actually saying, but I was going to say naughty as well. I was thinking all these things all at once, which is why I was like, ugh. But yeah, when you've got children who aren't well behaved, you kind of just want them out of your class. And I'm speaking from a point of view of a teacher. You don't want them in there because they're disrupting the learning of absolutely everybody else in the class, and the hard work to get to behave. And so, you know, when you're facing that every day and you've got all the pressures and stuff like that, it sometimes is just like easier to get them out of your class. But obviously that's not benefiting that student at all. And, you know, you should have measures in place to socialise that child better, because students that misbehave are always misbehaving because of what it's like at home, like always. You know, it's a lack of discipline at home, it's a, you know, not being monitored at home and things like that. Like, you know, you don't ever get a kid that's been well raised misbehaving in class. Like, you just don't get it. Like, so, you know, you've got to think, if they're not getting it at home, they really need it at school, so they really need you to be helping them. And so if you can't do that, then you just lead them into the prison system. You know, if you watch things like Educating Yorkshire and Educating all the other Essex and all the rest of it, like, it's, you know, the naughty kids, they need it the most, they need the help the most, and you can turn them around and they can, you know, obviously behave better and things like that. So that really should be the aim, and not to just get them out of the school, because as soon as they're excluded, like that's it, like who's monitoring them, because the parents have got to work, and it just, you know, it leads, you've basically failed that person, and you failed society, because society is worse because you've let that person be excluded. Vitale then also talks about how police have a lack of training within things like mental health, and don't really have an awareness of how to deal with people with mental health issues. And, you know, people with mental health issues don't necessarily respond in the way that somebody who doesn't have mental health issues does. And so when you're asking them to kind of like drop your weapon or whatever, like they're not going to respond in the same way. And it leads to things like them being killed unnecessarily. Also, he talks about how in the American system, it's easier to get help for mental health issues if you go within the criminal justice system, because there's more funding. So there's a lot of people in the criminal justice system there because of mental health reasons, and not because they've committed a crime, just because it's easier for them to get access to help, which is disgusting, isn't it? But obviously you can expect that, because you have to pay for medical care in America. So, you know, you're not getting any insurance, you're mentally unwell, what are you going to do? So, you know, a lot of people with mental health issues end up in the justice system, even in the UK. Like it's a, you know, this is why forensic psychology exists. Like there's a big section of society, you know, instead of being in the mental asylums, they're all now in prison. Vitale then also talks about how there is a criminalisation of things like sex work, drugs, immigration, and actually if these things were legalised, you would be able to deal with them in a more humane way, and people would have kind of, I mean, it gives an example of sex workers. So because sex workers are, you know, because it's an illegal thing to do within the UK, USA, you know, places like that, there's no protection for those people, and so it's quite frequent that those women and men sometimes get raped, and there's nothing that they can do about it because they're a sex worker, and they will get criminalised if they report that act. And so in places where it's legalised, so for example in Holland, sex workers are protected, and, you know, things like that are less likely to happen, and so therefore it's a more humane thing, and, you know, you are more likely to be able to regulate it. It's going to cost you less to actually kind of enforce, and it will reduce crime, because, you know, there's less criminal acts, like, you know, and you'll be able to be aware more of when there is criminal things taking place. So it's advocating for, you know, legislation that's more humane for people, rather than just criminalising them. You know, similar for things like immigration, you know, people often are fleeing from war-torn places, and they're coming into the country for safety. I mean, I suppose you could argue that they should be applying for asylum and things like that, but often they don't have documentation, and they don't have, you know, the things that they're required to be able to seek asylum. So, you know, you're criminalising them as an illegal immigrant. But, you know, I give you an example as well. I just came into my mind then. In America, you know, you've got, is it ICE, that's the organisation, they're keeping people in cages and separating mothers and children from each other. And yeah, okay, they're an illegal immigrant, but that doesn't mean you get to treat them like, I was going to say treat them like an animal, but you shouldn't even be treating them like that. Like, you should be treating them with dignity and respect, as you would an animal as well. You know, so it's a bit disgusting really, but because they're deemed a criminal, it's almost like everything about that person is a criminal, but actually the only criminal thing that they've done is to try and seek safety or a better economic life. You know, if you wanted to move cities because the city that you were in didn't offer you the opportunity, you'd be able to do that. But because it's across a land border or a, you know, sea border or whatever, I don't know why I said land border, because it's across an international border, that's what I was getting at. That means that you're now a criminal, like. And a lot of this stuff as well is that Vitale's talking about is supported by statistics. It's supported by a lot of the research that he's done and things. So it really makes you feel like you're kind of living in a dystopia, and it was very interesting to read. I would definitely recommend it. I'm really happy actually, because this was recommended to me by someone at my book club as an alternative to the book club book, because they've been a bit shocking recently. So yeah, I was really happy to read this. Very good book, gave it 4 stars, and I would definitely recommend it. And just to give you some kind of insight and awareness into the police system and what the problems are with it, and why so many people have issue with police. It is from the perspective of somebody who's not thinking that the police are doing a good job, I would probably caveat with that, because obviously, you know, look, there are lots of police that do a great job and are, you know, trying to do their best to help everybody. But yeah, I think it's talking about the systemic problems with policing rather than, you know, individual police officers or whatever. It's kind of almost like supporting that police need to have those structures in place for them to be able to do a good job, and it's not necessarily the police on the ground that are the issue. It's the organisation and the aims of that organisation, and because it's not really, you know, progressed much from history and things like that. So yeah, I definitely recommend it.